Here's how the program announced today is going to work. It's called the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility. It's a long way of saying LEAF, that's the acronym. It'll provide loans to companies with more than $300 million in annual revenues. It's open to businesses across all sectors that have a, quote, significant footprint in Canada. The businesses have to be in financial trouble because of the COVID-19 downturn. It's not for companies that were already in trouble. And those businesses also have to have at least $60 million in financing. There are some strings attached to these loans, including the companies have to respect collective agreements and protect worker pensions. There will be limits on executive pay. Businesses have to share their climate action plans, and companies convicted of tax evasion will not be eligible. The feds are also expanding other financing programs for mid-sized companies. We want to bring in the president of the Treasury Board to get some details, more details on this announcement. Jean-Yves Duclos joins us from the foyer of the House of Commons. Hi, Minister Duclos. Good to see you again.
Good afternoon, Vashi, and good afternoon to everyone listening.
Minister, your government says, as I outlined there, that these loans will come with strings attached. One of the specific strings is that companies are going to have to companies that want to access this money will have to limit executive pay. What does limiting executive pay mean specifically?
So I'll come to your question very quickly, but the objective of that LEAF program is to protect workers, to protect taxpayers, and to protect our future. Protecting workers because we want those companies to invest in maintaining their workers, protecting taxpayers because, as you've said, we are going to put into place severe restrictions around executive compensation, around share buybacks, around dividends, and that's because we want the money to go to the workers, not to the owners or to managers or executives. And finally, as you've also said, which is very important, we want to protect our future. So to protect our future against climate change and also to protect our future in a sense that we want to maintain the economic fabric of our society by making sure that these large corporations are going to maintain their supply chains with smaller businesses.
With respect, Minister, those are the broad strokes of the conditions that you're placing on these loans. When you say you're going to limit executive pay, what exactly does that mean? Will, for example, executives who receive government loans be able to get a bonus, or will that completely be outlawed?
So as you'll see in very soon, you'll see some very important details that will do exactly that. To limit executive compensation, because now is not the time for executives to use the emergency to pay themselves bonuses, for shareholders to receive excess dividends, and for other individuals who are doing quite well, and certainly in relative terms, not to take advantage of the current emergency to use taxpayer dollars to boost their standards.
Respectfully, though, again, that doesn't specifically answer the question. I understand that you're using the words restrict or limit or in excess of, but what exactly will executives be able to do? I'm asking you just because of what we've seen in the past when loans from the federal government were used and years later Canadians are laid off, but we still see executives getting bonuses. I just want to be unequivocal here. Will CEOs of companies that receive government money be able to, through this loan program, be able to take bonuses?
Well, two things. First, you've mentioned really well that we have learned lessons from the past. We want to avoid absolutely making the same mistakes that we did in the past. And the second thing is exactly that. We are going to put severe restrictions, and the details of those restrictions will be announced very soon, on all executives and on their compensation, as well as on shareholders not to receive the dividends that they would normally receive would not be allowed, on share buybacks, and all those things that will make sure that the taxpayer dollars that we're using to issue these emergency loans are there to protect workers and to protect our small businesses and the supply chains that link them to larger corporations.
You say that those details will be announced in the coming days. Does that mean this week? Will taxpayers know exactly what conditions are attached to these loans this week?
Well, the Minister of Finance, as you would expect, and Minister Baines, who is also very much involved as Minister of Industry, are working very hard on making sure that these details, when they are provided, are the exact details that then large corporations will be able to use, again, to protect workers, to protect pensioners, to protect the small businesses, to protect our future, and to protect the taxpayers.
Is there a cap to how much a company can receive in a government loan?
Well, the minimum loan that is eligible to that new program is $60 million. That's because we're looking at large corporations. These corporations must have an income of over $300 million. Obviously, the level and the timeline for delivering those loans will depend on individual circumstances, but always with the vision and the philosophy of protecting our society, our workers, and protecting our economy.
I take your point about the intent, but are you saying that there is no upper limit to how much a company can receive in a loan?
Well, we would expect most companies to be able to draw on existing financial market mechanisms. So it will not be all companies. There will only be some companies. And because of what we are going to put into place in terms of restrictions, we expect the appetite of most large corporations to be relatively modest, because with all the strings attached that we are going to put, there will be all sorts of restrictions which will indicate clearly to large corporations that their use of those public dollars comes with a number of limits, and therefore with some lower appetite for their use.
I understand what you're saying there, but I don't really understand what relatively modest means. And I tell you why I'm asking again. The province of Alberta has estimated the need for liquidity from bigger companies in the oil patch to be at least $20 billion. So are taxpayers going to be loaning $20 billion? Is that the neighborhood? I mean, you must have an estimate of how much this will add to the deficit, for example.
Well, the amount you just mentioned would be the total liquidity necessity for these large corporations. But as we've said just a moment ago, we expect much of those liquidity demands to be met by private market, financial market mechanisms. In fact, many of the oil companies that you have in mind have been able to access financial market liquidities over the last few weeks. We expect that to continue, and it will be true for other sectors of the economy.
So what is, Minister, the estimate that your government is working with for the total cost of the program?
Well, there will be a cash cost, meaning how much money we are going to loan through these emergency loans, through these different large corporations. There will be, obviously, administrative costs to managing this program, but that this, I believe, Canadians will understand that these costs are going to be rather modest in the broad perspective of looking after our economic fabric, making sure we go through this crisis as quickly as possible and emerge more quickly and stronger.
What I'm wondering, though, Minister, with respect, is what is modest? And I take your point that this is going to depend on each individual company, but surely there is, some sort of number that your government is working with. We are willing to lend out $20 billion, $30 billion, $2 billion in total. Is there any kind of restrictions in that vein?
Well, we'll see. And when the details are announced, we'll also hear from large corporations their actual level of demand for for those emergency loans. So it's both a supply and a demand framework context. So there will be, as we said, of course, through LEAF, liquidities available for transitional support in the crisis, but there will also be a serious work to be done by large corporations to see whether they really want to use those mechanisms, that really want to seek that level of financial support from the federal government, given all the restrictions that will come with that federal loan emergency program.
Speaking of restrictions, will there be anything to prevent these companies from restructuring later on, for example, years down the road, and ending up writing off this debt?
Well, this is a transitional loan. This is not a bailout. This is not a blank check. This is for companies that are viable, that have the potential to go through this crisis and emerge more strongly. And in fact, what you'll see in a few days from now, when the details come out, is that as we expect, that loan program is strong enough to help those large corporations go through the crisis, and if, as we also expect, those large corporations emerge more successfully, there might even be gains to the federal government in launching this program.
There's also a caveat that your government has attached for climate, and we spelled it out at the beginning there, but I'm wondering if I could get some more details on that. You say that a recipient of this money has to have a detailed climate plan. What kind of detail are you looking for? It has to fit into the federal government's plan as well. And what happens if you've determined that it doesn't fit in the plan? Does that mean that they get the money taken back? What goes on there?
Well, three different things. First, as we've said earlier, we want that program to be future-proof in the sense of protecting our future against the impact of climate change. Second, we announced clearly in the campaign that we want to exceed our commitments for the 2030 Paris climate goals. And we also announced during the campaign that we have an objective of zero emission for 2050. So our goals and aspirations are clear, and we expect and will demand the corporations to abide by those goals and demonstrate how they will be there to meet those targets.
What happens if they don't? And I'm asking you because your critics have accused you of including this as political cover for people who are worried, for example, about the federal government, your government, subsidizing bigger oil companies. Is this a political decision to put it in here, or will it have real meaning?
Well, of course, when we make those decisions, those are, in a sense, political decisions. But they are political decisions in the sense of supporting our values and our objectives. I think most Canadians have demonstrated that we want our society, our environment to be sustainable. We want a clean environment, and that goes through, that includes the abiding by our commitments for Paris in 2030 and our commitment to have no emission by 2050. So these are political in the sense that we have political values, which are, as I said, supported by the majority of Canadians, and we are therefore pleased to put those values into the LEAF program.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Minister Duclos. Pleasure as always to have you with us.
Thank you.
We are establishing a large employer emergency financing facility to provide bridge financing for our largest employers if they are unable to obtain financing through other means. But let me be clear. These are bridge loans, not bailouts.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau there, careful with the wording around today's latest measures to mitigate the economic impact of COVID-19. Why is the government worried about what we call this loan program for big businesses? When is a bailout not a bailout? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in. Over in Toronto, Melissa Lantsman, National Vice President of Enterprise Canada. Coming to us also from Toronto, Council of Public Affairs Brad Levine. And Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister, joins us from Montreal. Hey guys, great to see you.
Hey, nice to hear you. Hey. Hi, everybody.
Okay, so Brad, why don't I start with you? So some concerns from the opposition about what the strings are attached to this. I just interviewed Minister Duclos. Sounds like the details of those conditions are coming in the couple days. Your overall take on what was announced today?
Well, yeah, I think that the details are very important. There's a handful of areas that we just need to know much more information about. On the issue of having an environmental plan. The minister was just mentioning that a company, a recipient of this bridge loan, needs to make sure they have an environmental plan. What are the standards that are going to be employed by the federal government to ensure that that company gets it? What will be a passing grade? What will be a failing grade when it comes to that? There's other elements in the press release today, things like, there can't be excessive executive payouts. Well, what is excessive in the eyes of this government? And of course, transparency. Will Canadians be able to see each and every one of these loans and the terms of these loans? There's lots of talk about keeping jobs. How long do the jobs have to go for? Will it be the entire workforce, or will it be the payroll that will be the benchmark? So, before Canadians and seeing their tax dollars go to large employers and seeing if this is a good program or not, we still need a tremendous amount of questions to be answered.
Melissa, what do you think?
Well, I think Brad touched on something really important, and that's where Canadians are concerned about this, and the fact that these loans don't become loans that are forgiven, and that we're not in a situation where we potentially have another Bombardier. Now, the government, what I don't understand from a political perspective is that the government has really been sort of beating its chest about something that is coming in 6 weeks, for the last 6 weeks, to the oil and gas industry. And then this was announced. So, imagine you're the CEO of one of these large scale companies, and this is the announcement that you got. And of course, in typical fashion, I think that you get an announcement with an acronym and a program and very little detail, which leaves Canadians rightfully concerned that they're going to be on the hook for a lot of money at the end of this.
How does it, I'll get to Yolanda in 1 second, how is it bad news for oil company CEOs? I'm unclear on that, because it sounds like there's no cap,
I don't think
right?
It's necessarily bad news. I think this is a good start. And then I think that there's some industries where this is going to potentially just refinance losses. We have an oil price that is sort of rock bottom. We have airlines where nobody is taking airplanes, and we don't know how soon that will come back. So from a Canadian perspective, and the fact that tax dollars are going to those loans, we're going to want a little bit more assurance that these loans will be paid back in a way where there's some certainty.
Yolande, what do you think about that, and specifically the piece? And I get inundated with mail from Canadians who are, I think they understand that there needs to be help during this time for sure, but they're worried about the return on investment, really.
Sure, I understand that. And to your point, and to Brad and Melissa's point, that Canadians are obviously within their rights to understand it's tax dollars. Are we going to get the return on the investment? And the government is most certainly going to have to answer the details to those questions when they give more details in the coming, whenever that comes in the coming days and so forth. But I think it is important to go back to the general principle here, in that there has been obviously request on behalf of businesses to be able to get help. And when we look at the guiding principles that the government has announced today, I think that they're on the right path. I mean, Melissa alluded to Bombardier here. I can tell you that notably in the French press, there was a lot of backlash from the population because of some of the decisions that were made after the provincial government made decisions to invest. And it's clear by what was announced by the Liberal government, the federal government today, that they are trying to safeguard this by the measures that are put in place. Yes, details are important, but to send a clear message that collective agreements, pension plans, limiting the ability for shareholders to buy in and dividends, you are already sending Canadians a message that, hey, this is not a free pass here. And I think the Prime Minister was also clear on the fact that, you shouldn't be stopping here first. This is for people that should be first, our big businesses that should be going to try to get access through private sector.
He called them the lender of last resort. Big discussion here today and big announcement from the federal government that big money is coming to big companies in Canada. The feds are promising a loan program to help larger corporations weather the economic storm brought on by COVID-19. They say the program is open to all sectors, but Conservative leader Andrew Scheer had some questions about that plan. Take a listen.
Well, I guess my question for Mr. Morneau is this the package that he's promised the oil and gas sector? Because if this is it, this is certainly not what was promised nor what was expected. As I said, there are so many details that are missing from this announcement this morning. Mr. Morneau promised an industry-specific package to the oil and gas sector that would address the very, very unique set of circumstances and the very specific challenges that sector is facing. So if we're having question period, if we're having regular accountability sessions in the House of Commons, that would be my question for Mr. Morneau is this it?
And the House will be sitting on Wednesday. The federal government also says the loan does come, or loans will come, with some strings attached. The NDP, however, wants more details on those strings. NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh joins me now from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well, Vashi.
Mr. Singh, you tweeted in response to the government's announcement today, quote, any government help that goes to large companies must be tied to creating or maintaining Canadian jobs. Help must go to workers, not to CEOs. The government, Mr. Singh, says that there will be strings attached to these loans. Companies, for example, will have to respect collective agreements, pensions. They have to limit executive pay. Isn't that what you're asking for?
Well, one of my biggest concerns was they said they would limit CEO bonuses and limit share buybacks. Well, what amount is appropriate? If this is public dollars going to a company, I would say no CEO bonuses are appropriate. No share buybacks are appropriate. In addition, they mentioned that they would not be giving support to those who've been convicted of tax evasion. Well, we've said that it's actually legal tax havens which are the problem. The CERA went after Loblaws for about $360 million of tax revenue that was uncollected because of a purchase of a bank in the Caribbean, which was found to be legal. And so that's the problem. We need to not allow offshore tax havens who are expressly designed to avoid paying taxes. And finally, instead of giving loans, which we've seen in 2008, were used by some companies, they restructured and then wrote off the loan as bad debt, and Canada was never able to recover. Instead of loans, we'd like to see equity. It's the same amount of money, but just structured as equity as opposed to structuring as a loan.
What exactly would that prevent? Them writing off the loans? Because in 2008, there was an equity stake taken. And still, as you point out, some of the money that the government ended up loaning or using to bail out these companies never got paid back?
Well, the loan is very easy to restructure and to never pay back. An equity stake, you at the end of the day still own shares, you still own a portion, and then you have more likelihood of recovering. So I think that's better. You also have a stronger leverage to ensure that the strings attached are followed through. The equity gives you much more leverage than a loan. And so I want to see really firm and concrete strings attached. The fact that there is some or a limitation on the amount of CEO or bonuses, that there's a limit on share buybacks, that to me makes no sense. And using the loan, which is very open to being used in a way which will never get returned, versus an equity position, which is much more effective.
Do you think it's viable, though, for example, for the federal government to take an equity stake in, let's say a dozen companies in the oil patch or all the airlines? Is that truly the most effective way to get this done?
Well, if they're going to offer loans, then instead of a loan, which is very difficult to repay in some cases, then an equity is the same amount of money being spent. It just ensures that there's actually more ability to hold the government, to hold the company to account, and there's more likelihood of recovering that. So if you're going to spend the same amount, but it can be spent in a way to have some equity, so you're guaranteed more likely to get that money back, versus a loan, I would say we should do the equity. At the end of the day, I don't want to see any of the money going to enrich those at the top, the shareholders, or the CEO. The money has to be tied to Canadian jobs, and there isn't a clear requirement that money has to be tied to keeping jobs in Canada, maintaining or creating jobs in Canada. That requirement is something that's definitely missing as well.
What about the issue of transparency? I just want to make sure I get it articulated clearly on the show tonight. We know with 2008, the Auditor General said that there wasn't a high level of transparency. We also know there was great pressure on the government to intervene because of the economy at the time. That pressure is equal now, if not greater. What kind of transparency? Do you want to see all the terms of every loan made public?
Well, we want to see really the most important requirement, or the most series of important requirements are, one, that every dollar is directly linked to a Canadian job. It can't be the case that a company takes public money and in some way shuts down their company and opens up in another jurisdiction. It has to be tied to local and Canadian jobs. Secondly, we cannot see any money enriching the executive suite. So there should not be a limit. It should be actually not allowed for a CEO to use public money in any way to give themselves a bonus. There should not be any way that public money should be used for a share buyback. That has to be a strict no, not a limit, is what I'm hearing from the government so far. So we'll pay close attention, but we want to make sure the money actually goes to workers. It can't just go to a company that enriches its company but doesn't actually create a job in Canada. Otherwise, what's the point of supporting a sector if it's not going to create jobs in Canada?
Do you have any concerns when it comes to the sectors in which this will apply? The Prime Minister made it clear that fairness was one of the guiding principles of this policy. They do want all sectors in all provinces and territories to have access to it.
I definitely want all sectors to have access. My concern is, though, there should be a criteria of sustainability. And what I mean by that is, for example, in the States, when there was the talk of the buyback or the bailout of the automotive sector, there was a requirement placed in the States that companies had to invest in electrification of vehicles, knowing that that's the future of cars. Well, in Canada, none of that similar, those strings were not attached. And so the investments didn't require automotive companies to open up plants where they're building the cars of the future. So similarly, for every sector, there needs to be that sustainability. Will this create a long-lasting job that will help us reduce emissions, but create jobs for the long term, not just for the next couple of years, but for the next couple of decades and beyond?
So what does that, how would that rather apply, for example, to the oil sector? We know that sector has been hit sort of with a double whammy, not only because of depressed demand for oil, but also because of a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. How would an oil company meet those conditions that you just laid out where sustainability is concerned?
Well, so first off, we want to see that in particular with the oil and resource sectors, that the money that we're providing to those companies or those sectors goes directly to keeping jobs in Canada and maintaining those jobs. The second point, the sustainability, is to see a business case where those companies are laying out a case for long-term jobs that are sustainable. And whatever that is, we'll give the companies the flexibility, but we want to see long-term projections. So whether it's orphan wells that are being used as geothermal sites where they can create energy for the long term and create jobs for the long term. We need to see a plan of sustainability. It can't just be investments we make now that are short term for the next couple of years. The investments we make now will help define the next couple of decades, and those sustainability criteria need to be there.
In principle, Mr. Singh, are you okay with the idea of oil companies, bigger oil companies from the patch, availing themselves of this money? And I'm asking because you know that your counterparts in the Green Party and the Bloc Québécois declared last week that oil sands oil is dead.
Well, I think that the focus has to be on the workers, and the workers are very much there, and the workers are very much struggling. So we need immediate help to go to those workers. But those workers also need a long-term future. They want to know that their jobs are going to be there for the long term. And so that means making some serious decisions about how those jobs can be converted into jobs that will be long-lasting. And that's why I mentioned that the sustainability criteria should be there. Governments should support businesses that make a commitment to create jobs that are going to be in the long term available for workers. And that criteria has to be satisfied.
What if the commitment that those companies make is that they will be producing and selling oil for years to come, and therefore they believe there is a sustainable future for Canadian jobs in oil?
Well, oil executives themselves have admitted that their forecasts for the future are very different. The steps of the past will not work in the future. And many executives know that. But more importantly, we know that. We know that we cannot go back to the past. That did not result in a good outcome. That's how we got to this point. So it can't be by going back to doing the same thing that was done in the past that somehow we'll expect a different outcome. So that simply makes no sense. We know that the future is one of renewable energy. The future is one of clean energy. And the future is one of sustainability. And people want that to happen. Workers want that. And so we know that that's what we need to encourage. And those are the type of strings that need to be attached with any investment in any sector.
I guess I just want to make sure I'm clear. Do you want an oil company to agree to convert to renewable energy in order to avail themselves of the money the government's putting forth? Because that doesn't seem very pragmatic.
I want a company to ensure that they're going to create jobs that will be long lasting, and that they are also acknowledging the type of world that's being created, the direction we're headed in as a society. We need to know that the investments are being made in a reasonable and a sustainable way. That means companies need to be serious about what are their projects that will be foreseeably useful and have profit and create jobs that are long lasting. And so companies have to take a hard look at that. And we are here to support workers and companies that will ensure that those workers have good jobs.
But on the face of it, for example, if Suncor is applying for a loan, are you against that?
I'm only against the situation where a company takes a loan or takes money and doesn't have a strong ironclad condition that that's going to create or maintain jobs. If they're going to take money and not create jobs, then that's a no right off the top. The second element of it is I want to know that a company is projecting the future and making decisions that will create jobs that won't be just short-term 1 or 2 year jobs, but I want to see a real investment that creates a job that a worker can build a good life for themselves and their family. That's something that companies should be held to account for.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Appreciate your time today.
Of course, thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.